Well, thank you all for coming today. Hopefully you can hear me okay. It's not too loud. We very much appreciate your interest in today's topic. And when we spoke about preparing for this the other night, the agreement that we made was we were just going to be very candid about the experiences thus far and just try to be as genuine we can about some of the obstacles we've had to overcome together and how we've been working together to transform the city's cybersecurity initiatives for almost 3 years now is how long we've been working, I believe. And one of the things that we also talked about that really impressed me about you when we first sat down was you shared with me that your mission was to bring and build upon your experience at the NSA and the Navy, to bring those best practices and experiences with emerging technologies to protect the city of Phoenix. Will you mind giving everybody kind of an overview of how you came to that conclusion and how you've applied it here at Phoenix?
Sure. So when I graduated college, I went into the Navy as a cryptologic tech. And I was mainly centered around signals intelligence collection. This is in the early days of cyber, but they called it, computer security or network security or something like that. And then I got introduced to this through the Defense Intelligence Agency, through my job in the Navy. I was directly associated with the NSA. I ended up getting recruited out of NSA to go be a red team operator and then team lead. And so we were basically running hacking operations through the U.S. military, Air Force One, White House, all kinds of weird stuff. And we were watching what was happening out in the world as bad guys, mainly nation states, but a lot of crime sorts of things, but not to the proliferation it is today. We were watching how they were attacking, federal entities and so forth. Fast forward, as I kind of progressed through my career, just did different things, and I went actually back into the Navy as an information warfare officer. This time focused basically solely on cyber warfare, and the proliferation of cyber it's almost like nations no longer had nations that didn't have nuclear weapons couldn't really compete. Now anybody can go to the dark web. You can do ransomware for hire. You can you just Google how do you do, whatever it is you want to do, and you can just wreak total havoc across organizations. So when you're coming to state, like state of Alaska or the city of Phoenix, generally speaking, there are some, but there's not a whole lot of us military/intelligence community people coming into organizations that have virtually no cyber background or no cyber program. And so you're walking around with all this stuff in your head, and you're like, oh my God. And you're trying to keep your internal monologue to yourself. But you're looking around the organization, and in 90-something% of the time, the organization is trying to do the right thing. Yeah. But the problem is they don't understand what they're doing a lot of times. They don't understand the second and third order effects of what they're levers are pulling or buttons they're pushing or things that are just kind of getting plugged in. And then that's where, people like me would come in and say, well, hey, if you do that, then this thing is going to happen. And so when I came to the city of Phoenix, I kind of just took a step back as best as I could and just kind of observed what was going on in the agencies, who's who, watching who people think that they are. Because we have a lot of people that, say that they're cyber people, but they don't have a background in it, and it's so we're taking this approach where we're trying to build up our defenses while keeping the city moving in the up and to the right position, and educating the staff, these IT staff, in a non-confrontational way. And so that's how I was approaching, building the city's cyber program with all of this sort of bad stuff in my head that the NSA and the military sort of got their claws in me and just said, hey, look at all this bad stuff. And so just trying to make sure that it doesn't happen to the city.
Yeah. Very well said. And one of the things I know that originally brought us together was, I believe, you and your deputy CISO had caught wind of some of the work that MixMode was doing with the federal government. And some of the trends that we discussed very early on, I think, are very applicable today. And some of the things that we hear on a regular basis is that there's now more than ever an emphasis on real business outcomes as it relates to cybersecurity, rather than a focus and investment in legacy acronyms. I want a SIM for this, or user behavior analytics system for this, or an NTA system for that. The approach that we're hearing from both the analyst community and from our customers is that the business outcome is the number one priority. And the biggest challenge associated with achieving the desired business outcomes is the volume of data and the disparity in the types of data that are required. You mind giving your perspective on, first and foremost, maybe this idea of how to approach previous acronyms in defining your cybersecurity strategy, and how to include modern approaches that include all of the required data?
So cyber to me is like a game of cat and mouse, right? So the mouse is always trying to get whatever, and then the cat's trying to get the mouse, and it's just this ongoing evolution between the two. And I look at cyber as sort of the same thing. Bad guys are improving their attack techniques. The vendor community, they are the ones who are developing countermeasures and defenses to those techniques. And back in the day, siloed tools might have been that's kind of the only way to go. I mean, that's what you had. But we are moving away from that. There's another model too. It's sort of that all-in sort of ecosystem. Product suite, if you will, and if you don't buy one or two of the things, the whole deck of cards, house of cards does not work. Or worse, if one or two of those components get compromised, you're sort of screwed. And so, the other perception here is that we don't have an army of people. And so even if you had each of these siloed tools, we don't have analysts to actually run these tools, and then of course you're going to need to cross-train. We don't have the people to cross-train, so it becomes this sort of avalanche effect. So if we can find tools that are automating a lot of the work on the analysts, and now the analysts can prioritize on a thing rather than doing the old school sort of way of doing things, then that is a force multiplier, as you used to say in the military. And then the other thing too is some of these best-in-class tools, as they start partnering together, that actually again is another force multiplier. So when you have organizations like we're using like CrowdStrike and Proofpoint as an example, those two they're working together to share information between their two platforms, and that's really beneficial for us. So if we can kind of cut down on this tool does this, and this tool does this, and this tool does this, and the quote single pane of glass, you can throw a rock through it, and then now all of a sudden nothing works, and you can't. If you can't line up all of these items and say, hey, right over here there's this bad thing occurring because you're having to look at all these different consoles, then something that is more automated is taking a place of all those tools, provided it actually works, right, is key. And so Mitch and I, my deputy, we get really concerned about things like when you're constantly hearing AI and deep learning and machine learning and everything's AI, right? Except it's not. But when we were doing our eval, that's one of the things that we were looking at, is because the SIM tool is so complicated and requires so much care and feeding. This is where we were really like, okay, let's see if we can actually get close to what would be considered AI.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a second, because I think it was very interesting to me when we first started working together that you shared that you were approached by a federal agency notifying you of the prevalence and severity of these coordinated nation-state-sponsored attacks, those that were purposefully designed to circumvent traditional rule and threshold-based systems. This approach of kind of query and data lake types of scenarios that are the primary approach that we've used historically with SIM and coordinated solutions like their equivalents. And I remember that when we first were engaged with one another, the objective that you shared was to have MixMode's artificial intelligence system deployed in parallel with your existing systems to measure, in kind of a watcher scenario, the effectiveness of a self-supervised AI platform compared directly against human operator experience and some of the legacy platforms. Do you mind telling everybody about that experience and what was gained?
So our old platform, it was interesting. It was lots of data lakes, and it was only focused on about 5% of the city's network, and it was very much focused on PCI. And when you go back years, the city, there wasn't really much of a security program, but they were very concerned about PCI. So that was sort of like Cyber 101 with the city. And so that's kind of how the cyber program was born at the city. The problem is that kind of like Target, you were PCI compliant, but you ignored the rest of your security program. So you had lots of alerts. I'm like, so this is kind of playing in the back of my head. I'm like, we have like 100 people logged into this tool, and none of them are security people. Why is that? And who's doing the care and feeding? And it's like, well, whoever. And it was only there for PCI, so what about the other 95% of the organization? So as we started kind of going down this when we were doing our evaluation, we were looking at the typical SIM vendors, and the problem we were running into is they couldn't scale. I guess unless you wanted to create another data center, because at one point, one of the vendors was like, you're going to need like 1,200 data lakes. And I'm like, 1,200 data lakes? I think data oceans, like water world. I'm like, come on, man, there's no way. And that didn't even include the backups. And so we needed something where we could store data for a year, have 90 days of hot data, for PCI requirements and other sort of regulated framework requirements and so forth. But we needed it to be where an analyst could come in, and there was not a 6 to 12 month ramp up time to learn the tool. Building the tool out to get it into all these different pockets of the city is one thing, right? That's on us, right? But if my analyst or analyst it's taking them that long to figure out anything, then this is not good. And so those are some of the key indicators that we were looking for, that would, the tool can help pinpoint where problems are. You can still do some signature-based stuff. You can have some weird queries and do some threat hunting, of course. But to us, where the gold was that the tool was doing a lot of the legwork as it should, and then helped pinpoint these problem areas, and then that kind of reduces the response time for our analysts, which is key. So it's not about like, did you get hit? Did you not get hit? It's, no, you did get hit, and how long did it take you to figure this out, right? And if we're talking weeks and months, that's really bad. If we're now down to days and hours, that's way better. And now that since we've had it for several years, we're now into generally the minutes when we're seeing something, and then we're able to start reaching out to departments and alert, hey, we're seeing this weird thing. What is this?
Yeah, I love that example. Let's talk a little bit more about it, if you don't mind. When we were going through the initial deployment, you and Mitch had some pretty strict criteria for us. I remember it was, we're going to start this thing on a Friday. I'm going to give you the opportunity to deploy this artificial intelligence platform remotely. And we don't want you to touch it. Our team's not going to touch it. And we're going to look on Monday at how effective this is at elevating some of these threats and risks. And if I'm remembering correctly, keep me honest, but there were some pretty severe incidents that were found within that first 24-hour period of deployment. And I believe it's been running in perpetuity ever since. Is there anything that you can share with us about that first week's experience of identifying some of these types of attacks?
Well, I think when we started getting the reports, there was a lot of explicatives that were dropped, and to me, this kind of struck me like the movie Aliens, where they're in the med lab, and the little beeper is going off on the gun, and the beeps are like within 3 or 4 meters, and they're like, that's inside the room, and then they all look up at the ceiling, they crawl up there and shine the light, there they are. That's kind of what it felt like, because we both had a sneaky suspicion that we were prepared for the worst. Yeah. And we knew it was sort of like a sieve. And so, but when we got the results and we were sort of looking at them, we're like, okay, this is really bad. We need to move forward with a procurement and get this tool deployed throughout, because we know we had like 4 federated departments and a lot of other places that are kind of doing like tinkering and that kind of thing. And there were some other strange things going on too at that same time. Like one of our vendors that was doing vulnerability management for us was only scanning about 25,000 assets, and we found out they weren't even doing credentialed scans, and then out you go. And we brought in we built it up in-house, and now we're at 76,000 endpoints that we've discovered. And so when your attack surface has just exponentially grown, and so now it's even more important as you're dropping in these sensors and you're trying to make sense of this data. When we first started this, I think the team thought we were at 2 gigabits a second.
Correct, yeah.
We're now at 30 gigabits a second, so that's north, south, east, west. That is a lot of data. And there's no way that an analyst is going to be able to sift through all that and try to link these events together, even if they were really great at rules and so forth. Again, there goes back to that care and feeding. And so that's why, for us, that this tool was really gold, because it cuts down that response time, which is key.
There's a couple of things I think I'd like to dig into with that one as well. There's this idea of visibility into the entirety of the data set. I think you shared with me recently that when you compared the MixMode deployment to the previous deployments, you were looking at roughly 15 times as much data, if I'm not mistaken, as you were with those tools. Would you mind sharing what that looks like in terms of how you look at cost and operational resources involved, and what that looked like with a MixMode deployment when you're continuously analyzing 15 times the data in real time?
I can tell you what the CIO at the time said to me. It might not be appropriate. There was more explicatives dropped. And he says, "What, are you crazy?" And I'm like, well, I'm not suggesting we actually go down this road. I'm just telling you that, at 2 gigabits, it was roughly $4 million. And at 2 gigabits going this other direction, and we have proof that it works, and we have no proof this other one was working, I'm not sure how you can even make the argument, unless we're going to say we're not getting a SIM. And I don't know who would do that, right? Now, if you literally have no money, then you're going to have to look at something else. You're going to have to maybe look at an MSSP or something along those lines. But just in terms of scaling our organization, Mitch and I both knew that we are breaking ground on almost every front. So there's a lot of unknowns for us, and when you're trying to figure out the budget for something like this, it can be pretty tough. So if you don't know your environment, it can get costly pretty quick as you're trying to ramp up. But when you compare it to other tools, and when we looked at those numbers at the time, it would have been exponentially more expensive. And honestly, where are you going to store 1,200 data lakes? Right? That's not going to fit in the data center. So,
great. One of the things we also learned that we really pride ourselves on at MixMode is reducing the number of false positives, accurately reducing the number of false positives without compromising the system's ability to identify both zero-day attacks and true positives. I believe we achieved greater than 95% reduction in false positives in that first week of deployment when compared to the legacy platforms. How much of an impact did it historically play for your team chasing down these kind of false positives? And how do you view false positive challenges in general?
Well, I think it goes back to knowing your environment. So we didn't really know the environment, right? And it's not a knock on anybody. It's just, Sea of Phoenix isn't alone in this. There's a lot of organizations I've worked on. They didn't know their environment either. We hit with WannaCry, and the Navy was like, well, how many systems does this affect? In my particular command that I was with, and it took 3 weeks for all the engineers to run around the Navy and figure out how many systems WannaCry was going to affect, and that's so we're not alone. False positives to me, if you looked at a graph, it was pretty much maxed out in white noise, right? And so Mitch and I were both kind of like, well, all right, so for the next year or whatever, we're going to be dialing down this white noise. We're going to learn, what is real and what isn't, because there's a lot of stuff that some of these departments are doing. It's just kind of odd. It's just they're just doing things, whatever their department needs to do for the needs of the business or whatever. But when you're trying to figure out what is real and what is not, and you're just not, basically whitelisting things, right? There is no whitelisting. What is this specifically, and who authorized it, and are we keeping it or not? And then that's how we're kind of driving down that white noise.
That's great. One of the things, I know you'll appreciate this slide, and we talked a lot about it early on, this idea that while the spend for cybersecurity platforms has continued to increase linearly at a minimum, mean time to detection, mean time to response has increased linearly as well, we've seen over the last couple of years. And that has created two kind of opposing positions in the cybersecurity industry. One is that this idea of stacking correlative analysis platforms on top of one another, SIM and UBA and XDR and NTA, has been reasonably effective and warrants further investment. I know you've taken a counter position in adopting modern self-supervised artificial intelligence and applying more sophisticated algorithms to data at the point of ingest rather than this data lake scenario to address these types of problems. What would you say to those that are still kind of grappling with this idea of should I go the traditional route with kind of the legacy silos of cybersecurity tools, or should I explore, in spite of the noise associated with some of the false misrepresentations of artificial intelligence in the market, how would you navigate that discrepancy between the two?
I would probably say that it just kind of depends on your organization and your environment. So if you're a bank, let's say, I've never worked for a bank. I've had some friends that work for banks. They're kind of telling me what goes on behind the scenes. But it's a pretty static environment. There's not a lot of change because change represents vulnerabilities and holes that they obviously don't want. And so where some products and some strategies for addressing cyber might work for them for like the city of Phoenix, where you have, what's the number, Steen? 29, 30 departments? It seems to fluctuate. So 29 departments, 30 departments, whatever. And everybody's kind of doing something different. And there's a lot of, I mean, it's just nature of the government. There's legacy applications out there that haven't necessarily been orphaned, but they need to be upgraded.
Sure.
Quick. And so for us, we need something that could adapt to this very sort of radical environment where, you know, what's going on in aviation is completely different than what's happening in the PD and fire department and water and all the rest of the departments that go in between. And how can we consistently approach alerts that are coming in and figuring out if these are you know, false positives, or these legit issues that we need to go look at. And I don't want my guys, and there's a couple of gals in there now, I don't want them to go to a whole bunch of different consoles unless we absolutely need it. So when we have vendors that come to us and say, hey, we want to sell you on this thing, and it'll solve everything for you, like a SOAR as an example. And you kind of start poking at it, and it's like, well, you have to have a mature organization, you have to have all your run book, you have to do this, and I'm like, we're not there. And so some of those things, you know, we need to kind of take a shortcut to a lot of that. And if the tools can work for us, then we are in a much, much better place. So the bottom line answer to this is it just sort of depends on your organization. What works for somebody else might not work for me. Tim Romer and I were talking about this, and you know, he's like, Shannon never recommends, you know, tools, generally speaking. And what I do is, it's you know, hey, we should probably listen. Where I've had other CISOs that are just they go on and on about every tool under the sun, and so you really need to, in addition to figure out what's going on in your organization, a proof of concept with some documented requirements and what are your expected outcomes. Because if you don't have that, how do you know that some tool was successful? And if you're not grading on that criteria and weighting it correctly, and you're looking at 5, 6, 7 SIMs or whatever it was we were looking at, how can you accurately figure out, you know, did the SIM A outperform SIM B, and how did it do that?
Yeah. You actually reminded me when you were talking about some of the additional departments. While you spoke originally about the initial deployment of 2 gigabits per second in total throughput, over the last year and a half, you've also been able to consolidate cybersecurity initiatives for all of these peripheral departments as well under one umbrella. I believe you described MixMode as being the backbone of the cybersecurity program and SIM for not only city core, but the peripheral departments, including police and fire and aviation and others. how did you go about that process, and what was it like in terms of bringing these different departments in to trust an emerging technology and the effectiveness of that technology in an area where they had been purchasing and supporting those processes independently?
So, like a lot of organizations, sometimes the security team is decentralized. So, just using our own organization. So aviation can have their security team, and PD can have theirs, and fire and water, and the rest of them down the line. The problem with that approach is that gets very costly very quickly, right? The other thing to look at, and this is where we were trying to figure out, do you want to centralize or not? Because that was one of the big questions I had when I was hired on. I'm like, are you trying to centralize, or am I just an advisor? There's pros and cons to each one. And the city manager at the time was basically like, he was asking me this sort of the same question. I said, if you don't centralize, it is on you to bring in each department and stitch together the risk, and you have to figure it out, right? And that's exactly what happened in the state of New York, right? And then the mayor at the time was like, nope, we're not doing that. We're centralizing security because we want one security team, and we're managing security across the organization. And so that's kind of how that centralization started. Now, the interesting thing is I've been in a lot of organizations where things are centralized, and everybody's like, they freak out, and they're like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. Because like I said, there's some cyber people in these other organizations, and they're doing cyber activities. They're not managing a cyber program, and the pushback was immediate, right? Like, get out of here, right? And but the interesting thing is I told them, as we're going through this, I'm like, just because we're centralizing doesn't mean you don't have a role. I don't know what goes on in your department, and I don't know all of these applications, right? And you multiply it out by 20 or 30 departments, or 29 or 30 departments, and that's a lot of information for like a small team to hold on to. So there is a definite need, even if it's centralized, to work closely with these other departments, especially when we're doing incident response.
Yeah, and that's all been centralized under one kind of line of business with you at the
I mean, and there's some interesting things going on, like there's some APT activity around different sectors of critical infrastructure, like aviation, right, across the U.S., and we're not immune from this. Sure. And so TSA with CISA will say, hey, airports, go fill out this survey, right? And oh, by the way, when you're marking all this stuff, you need to go fix all your vulnerabilities or whatever. And so that is squarely in the realm of aviation, but they understand right away, like, we're not the cyber experts here, you guys are. And so we partner with them to help answer their surveys accurately, and then figure out where are the gaps, and then kind of help put some mortar into those gaps and strengthen them.
You'd mentioned CISA and this federal investment in strengthening the infrastructure for critical assets and departments and things of that nature. And another kind of discrepancy that we run into quite frequently in the cybersecurity industry is, while we're seeing, according to Ponemon Institute, is the slide that's represented here, while we're seeing that greater than 80% of the successful attacks are in fact zero-day attacks. These are attacks that have been designed purposefully to circumvent rule and threshold-based systems. They're not just minor modifications of kind of the same hash value that's been used for a long time, and they're designed to get right around these systems. However, according to, I think I read it from Gartner recently, more than 95% of the spend in this area is on rule and threshold-based systems designed to focus specifically on known attacks. What advice would you give to both vendors in the industry as well as peers about how to reconcile this kind of discrepancy? Are these zero-day attacks, in fact, as serious and prevalent from nation states and others as we're seeing from the analyst community?
I would say they both suck. So a classic example of this would be, when the NSA cyber warfare tools walk out the front door with low tech, and they're put out on the net, and Shadow Brokers has them, and they're just sort of drip feeding them to the world. And it's rare when you see NSA responding, with you see Microsoft alerts, and you'll see some of the other, the vendors will come out and say, hey, there's this critical alert in Microsoft products or whatever. Yeah. But it's rare that NSA does this. So those to me are those catastrophic, apocalyptic sort of vulnerabilities that, the 0 days, right? And of course, there's some others. I mean, that's just sort of the nature of the game. I don't stress too much about whether it's a 0 day or a typical signature-based, sort of old school way of doing it. Bad guys, you have nation states all the way down to insiders who have an axe to grind with your organization, and then everybody's sort of in between. And they are all going after, generally speaking, the same sort of vulnerabilities in your system. Now, obviously, nation states now have, they're more apt to have some 0 days. But, what difference does it really make when you're compromised at that point, right? And so if we're looking at tools that are generally considered best in breed, best in class, especially if they're not turning themselves into an ecosystem. There's an ecosystem where it makes sense. Mm-hmm. But if we're like one vendor and they have a tool that does everything for everyone all the time, I'm like, not really. But if we have best in class tools that are separate but they're working together and improving our security posture, especially in a very automated way, that's provable, then I think we're meeting the 0 day issue as well as some of your more traditional attacks.
Yeah, I agree. So addressing both is really important, right? Yeah. Being able to address the known types of attacks with rule and threshold based detections while also being mindful of the 0 day attacks.
I mean, we had an email storm maybe a year ago, maybe longer than that. It all sort of blurs together, but it was like 10,000 emails all loaded with Emotet. And I'm like, well, that sucks. But we fended it off, and none of them got through. We've had a couple of others where some emails got in, and there's multiple filters of this stuff, but occasionally something will get in because these things are not perfect. But the response then is key. So if it gets through, okay, that's bad, but how fast could we react to it? And how fast could we basically inoculate the city and then yank that thing out of everybody's inbox and basically detonate it? And it was fast. And so I think it's only happened maybe once or twice where we've had to, with something that's actually gotten in. When we look at the proliferation of USB, and people can bring in whatever device they want and plug it into whatever they want, whenever they want to. That starts entering in, making our attack surface much, much bigger and unnecessarily so. And one of the things I said as city manager was, there's no such thing as zero risk. You're always going to have risk, but do you need to really take on unnecessary risk, right? And if you don't need to do the unnecessary risk, let's do ourselves a favor and start closing off some of this stuff. And then that way we're only focused on these things and not all this other stuff just out of convenience.
Well said. I want to be mindful of time, and I want to leave room for questions as well. But you touched on something early on that I want to perhaps close in before we start talking about questions. And that was, you brought up this idea of the overuse of the term artificial intelligence. And when we were first talking together, both you and Mitch, we spent a lot of time going through very specific differentiating criteria. And I've listed some of the criteria here for everyone to kind of review. But I think when we were first speaking about what some of these challenges are, you had brought up this idea of the requirements for continued human intervention, a static baseline, real-time requirements, applying artificial intelligence to data on ingest rather than data at rest. And also this idea of, if we're dealing with technologies that are purposefully designed to circumvent rule and threshold-based detections, if you don't have that, can one really categorize it as artificial intelligence? What recommendations would you give to those that are still having a really hard time differentiating from some of the false claims of vendors, and how would you encourage them to evaluate solutions like MixMode self-supervised artificial intelligence to determine whether or not it's really going to meet their requirements?
I think it all comes down to what your requirements are, right? I'll have vendors say to me, hey, what are your what are your AI projects for the year? Or AI initiatives? And I'm like, I'm not looking for anything AI, dude. And but if we're looking at a tool to meet our NIST 853 modern security controls, and we have some gaps, and we're like, okay, so now we need a tool to address this. How can we do it in the most automated way possible? So I don't necessarily look at whether or not it's labeled as AI or deep learning or machine learning or any of that other stuff. I want to see what it's like in the proof of concept, right? And in this particular case, we had something to compare it to, which was the opposite of AI. It was very rule-based, and it was clear that if only PCI rules were set up, and even then, I'm not sure how well they were working. But so with your POC, with your requirements, the other thing I would look at is talk to your other CISOs. Right, we're out there, and we're here to help each other, most of us anyway. And because you'll see a lot of us saying, hey, this tool worked for us, but only in these kind of circumstances, or hey, we really like this company, is what they did. But companies change. Like we were just talking about this in the SOC briefing with Tim, and the tools change. So there's one school of thought that says get into a contract for 3 years, and another school of thought is just do it for 1 year. So us as CISOs and security professionals, we really have to stay on top of our organizations are depending on us to defend them. So it's on us to find reputable vendors that are meeting our requirements. If you don't know what your requirements are, you're sort of not in the catbird seat, so to speak, right? The vendor will be happy to tell you that what your needs should be. It's really on you to figure that out, and then run a POC and make sure that it actually works. And then do your due diligence. Like we'll look at Gartner for recommendations and what they say. Now it's just a data point. I mean, I know how some of that stuff works sometimes, but it's a data point. We talk to other CISOs, and we got to it's almost like Amazon reviews. So you really got to kind of scrutinize what people are telling you and ask the right questions. And then at a certain point, you make a decision.
Yeah, fantastic. So how do you feel about taking some questions from the audience?